from a welfare state perspective, one would look at other indicators of crisis and suggest that the crisis is far from over. There is a profound social crisis in Europe, and it never went away. And a number of different ways in which we can indicate that is there was a fairly high impact study published in the Lancet that has gotten some attention, that pointed to dramatic increases in suicides, infectious diseases, HIV, major health disasters actually emerging in the countries that were particularly under fiscal austerity regimes. This is another way of looking at crisis which doesn't really feature in more narrow economic considerations. Anecdotally, we know that there is, particularly in southern European states, certainly a lot of reports coming from Spain, that there is an increased strains on grandparents as unemployed parents move back to their childhood homes together with their kids because they no longer have a job and they cannot really support the families themselves. So they basically rely much more on the retired parents. And I think that all this indicates an increased burden on households as economic, or more to the point, reproductive units. And in Esping Anderson's parlance, we can say austerity is not only resulting in recommodification, but also refamilialization, where the reproductive burdens that had been taken on in modern industrial societies by the welfare state in the context of austerity, where it no longer performs, it is being put back onto the family. But the question is whether these family networks are actually able to take that strain. I think that this is an extremely important and under-researched, under-thematized dimension to the post-crisis landscape, certainly in Europe. And I think that it is in those terms we should pose the question about the performativity of the ideas, actions, and strategic contexts of crisis management and post-crisis landscape. I think that this gives us reason to go back to consider the core, what arguably could be seen as the core structural functional essence of the welfare state. That was very much the basic idea, the basic thesis of the now very, very unfashionable industrialization theory that used to be the dominant approach to how to study the welfare state in the 1970s, particularly made famous by the work of Harold Wilensky. And Harold Wilensky basically said ideology is secondary to the welfare state. No matter whether you are the liberal, social democratic, or Christian democratic welfare state, there are certain core functions that the welfare state performs that are inherent functions that need to be performed in an industrial society. And basically the theory goes like this. It is that industrial society where extended family networks and community networks break down as a process of capitalist industrialization. There are certain reproductive functions such as child-rearing, taking care of the elderly, also taking care of the possibility of unemployed. A whole set of risks emerge with industrial society that needs to be taken care of. Particularly the economic cycle and the reproductive cycle are desynchronized. And the welfare state can be interpreted as satisfying the need, this reproductive need. So the central thesis is that the welfare state is the product of the needs generated by the development of industrial societies. And I think that the crisis gives us reasons, I believe, for returning to this theory and this insight. Now, that is rather controversial. I mean, this is a theory that has been critiqued on a number of levels. It is very, very deeply structural determinist. It is functionalist. It says that there is a need, that it assumes that need is satisfied, rather than explaining the processes through which the satisfaction may or may not actually take place. It doesn't sort of hold out the possibility that if this need isn't satisfied, it's too bad for the system and the system will collapse. It just assumes, it's a reproductive functionalist fallacy. But it should be pointed out, so there are, to sort of put this on the table again, we need to there are a number of burden of proofs that one has to satisfy. One has to satisfy the idea that this is not a theoretical anachronism, an old theory that is rightfully discarded, and that it isn't an empirical anachronism. The other thing is that this is a kind of a story that generally is told with reference to developments in Europe at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, going back to the recent, for the Bismarck reforms, etc., etc., etc. So are they really relevant empirically and historically in the conjuncture that we have today? And I'm going to suggest that it is theoretically relevant and it is empirically relevant. You do not necessarily subscribe to the industrialization theory, but it poses salient questions that I think welfare research has lost sight of, that we need to come back to. And I would propose that we do so in the welfare workshop. But then let's look at the sort of the theoretical and the empirical side of this. The first thing that I would point out in terms of it not being a theoretical anachronism is that whilst there have been a lot of challenges to it in terms of, for example, the democratization thesis such as Flora and Alder came along and critiqued it for not taking into account process. Esping Anderson coming in and critique it for not taking into account welfare state variation that is a function of power mobilization. Or indeed a whole set of other theories that mainly focus on process, such as Pearson's welfare state retrenchment, Armindian and Bonoli on new social risks that actually again have new social risks. I think that it is fair to say that all these theories have been supplements. They have offered supplementary variables, but have never really challenged the core of the industrialization. None of these have falsified or even attempted to falsify that the welfare state is fundamentally playing a structural role in solving reproductive problems. And I think that the salience of the reproductive theme is amplified and affirmed and amplified by feminist research, which certainly is about the problematic of reproduction in the welfare state. I think that probably what feminist research would say is that in a way the problem with Walensky's thesis, and I think that this is right, that it makes this even more worthwhile taken into account in a kind of talking about the crisis, is that the welfare state never really was that good at dealing with the reproductive functions, and it actually still relied very much on the household and the gender power relations and patriarchy to do that. So there is a sort of a question of the crisis of this, and whether it is still possible to reproduce that structural role that women have had in the reproductive in reproductive political economy. And that has been very, very much sort of questioned even by the sort of European policy itself, with the Lisbon agenda and so on and so forth, which was about trying to find ways of making it possible for women and men to share reproductive labor while also being in wage labor. So the conundrum of increasing employment rates while still taking care of reproductive functions. And that is sort of broadly thematized in terms of the move from a male breadwinner to an adult working model. And I think that one could sort of put it like this. Is it possible to have an adult working model in the post-crisis landscape? And if not, how are reproductive functions going to be performed? And is it actually possible? Okay. And that brings us, I suppose, to the question of whether this is an empirical anachronism. And I think that there are good reasons to believe that this is a more enduring structural property that the welfare state serves, and a problem that comes with industrialization and capitalist industrialization, where the welfare state is invoked to do something. There have been, in East Asia, there has been a wave of social reforms in the last decade in terms of bringing in new social programs and so on and so forth, responding exactly to lower fertility rates. And this, so very much a kind of a reproductive problematic, the need of making sure that population growth don't go under a critical velocity has prompted social policy reform even in East Asia, which in some ways was very quintessential, the kind of familialist models. And indeed also we can look at the kind of the pre-crisis finance-led boom in Southern Europe, where there actually was, as Martin Rhodes pointed out, there was actually significant development of welfare state programs and expenditure and so on and so forth. And they were particularly targeting the reproductive field in terms of sort of family allowances, childcare, and so on and so forth. And now these societies are cutting back on that, but the reproductive functions maybe still need to be redressed. What happens when patriarchal norms and so on and so forth have been challenged? And I think that is, I am not proposing any answers here, but I think that these are sort of the salient questions that should be posed. At the same time, we have the puzzle. And that is that if you look at kind of the immediate post-crisis situation in Southern Europe, birth fertility and population growth rates actually increased rather than decreased. So in terms in sort of short-term timescales, and maybe this is not what this theory is supposed to sort of address, and maybe the structural properties operate over a longer timescale. But in the short run, certainly there would be a conundrum and anomaly that this theory would have to face. But I think that in many ways that makes it even more interesting to explore the reproductive dimensions to the crisis. So what I would propose is a set of thematic questions for a call for papers would be something along the following lines. Does research affirm that there is a reproductive dimension to the post-crisis landscape? How does state-of-the-art research address the questions of reproductive crisis, and is it adequate? And how should the emerging properties of the reproductive crisis be conceptualized if there is a crisis? And how should the reproductive crisis be addressed? So those would be some of my initial thoughts about how we may organize a workshop on the welfare state and the post-crisis landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Should I come up there, maybe?
I'll start. Just plenty of space.
Right, thank you. This is, it's nice to be back. I was in Birmingham for almost 8 years, so this is my kind of home, but I haven't been back for quite a long time, so it's kind of spooky to be here. It is like it was, but actually isn't. Walk down the memory lane. And thanks for having me. It's really nice thing to be invited to do this. I'm thinking on my feet here because, like Magnus said in the beginning, he didn't really provide a paper, and my comments are now improvised comments, partly improvised comments on his presentation, but some of these I thought about earlier already, and what he was saying, I think in many ways confirmed what I thought could be relevant to what you're doing here anyway, or we together. I mean, I think that the key question somehow in terms of the whole crisis debate on the welfare state to me is what makes it an interesting topic. I mean, I work on welfare anyway, so it's always interesting for me. But I think there's a lot of very persuasive theoretical literature out there, lots of evidence as well about different directions that we might be going to, but the picture is rather conflicting. I think that there's a lot of confusion, conflict, tension. I mean, that is the nature of the whole beast, and I think Magnus is ideas about bringing back the reproduction side of things is really important, because it brings us back to the very roots of the whole question. What is the welfare state there for, and who is it for? And I'll come back to how maybe there might be a couple of sort of more specific ways of answering those questions. But I wonder whether there's one aspect here that we're that we should concentrate on more, especially when we talk about the crisis, because when we look at the way in which the crisis is discussed, both in the media and in also certain academic debates, is that it's been taken at a very high level, very kind of general, broad level, and it's about the economy, it's about money, it's about finance, things that are actually, if we think what the welfare state is about, the crisis itself is lifted very high above the everyday lived experiences of the citizenry. And I think now connecting the welfare questions to the debates on crisis are potentially one way of grounding some of those issues. So I don't think we're looking at so much, Magnus's background paper talks about misdiagnosis in terms of the crisis. I don't think it's necessarily about just misdiagnosis. I think it's about the politics of the crisis. And I think the welfare questions are the area where some of these crucial political questions about the crisis are becoming really important. So we need to look at the political questions at the very heart of all this. Discursive construction of austerity. I mean, if we take ideas slightly further, it's also the kind of how are these ideas communicated, the ideas of crisis. It's very important. So I was going to say something about the importance of ideas, but Paul brought it in the very beginning, so I'm happy to hear that ideas, actors, and strategic action are important here in the whole series. And in Magnus's wonderful article in Public Administration, which is a special issue that I edited last year, he talks about the way in which we should look at ideas as not just a set of cognitive filters, but ideas actually we need to think about the performative role of ideas. That ideas need, ideas at a cognitive level actually do nothing. They might exist, but if no one takes them up, they're not going. We can't explain change through the change of ideas. And certainly asking questions about what ideas are taken up and what aren't, which ones are successful, which ones become policy, and so on. There are very complex questions about how ideas are communicated, how are they negotiated, mediated, and so on. And so there's an institutional element there too. And there's a crucial element of time as well. And that's what Magnus also points out in the article, which looks at why certain ideas about finance, global finance, financialization were not taken up by Swedish trade unions, and he points at the crucial element of time. So both in terms of institutional legacy, so we can go back to historical institutionalism or something like that, and then also these things about, in terms of the speed at which certain issues decisions have to be made, who is seen to have ownership over certain ideas and so on, are also very important. There's a hierarchy of ideas and the way in which certain ideas sort of permeate the public debates and certain others don't. So it's a very complex picture emerging, and I'm finding myself more and more kind of positively confused as we go along, but I think there are maybe some ways of going forward, and I would probably suggest three key elements. Some of them are probably signposts to me suggesting what kind of work or what kind of people might be useful in sort of including in your workshop. And I think first of all, we're now talking about a series of questions where I think more than ever before we have the need to really locate ourselves at the crossroads of international political economy and comparative political economy. I think comparisons are hugely important here. Again, because I mean, as a comparativist, I'm sometimes frustrated at this very general high level of discussion that is taking place on the crisis, that is very international, it's very, we talk about global finance and all that. Whereas if we go back to the idea of making that connection to thinking about the everyday lived experiences of people, we actually seriously need to think about how are those broad international, global effects, how are they mediated via national institutions, even local institutions? And so I think comparisons are really important here, comparative work. Variations between cases, again, how, the variation that we have across Europe, for instance, in dealing with the crisis, in terms of welfare solutions, there's lots of variation there. And I think the explanations to that, or I'm trying to make more sense of that variation, is really important in trying to get back to the core debates about reproduction and so on. So that's the first kind of call I would make in sort of trying to say what's important. I think serious comparative work is needed here. Secondly, I think in order to kind of ground that process of grounding, maybe I should have even started with this, grounding the issues from that very general global level or international, whatever is your favorite term, we also need a serious look at the European level. And not only European level in terms of talking about the euro or the free market, but actually talking about the European Union's limited but yet some attempts of moving towards some kind of coherent approach on social policy. So the questions about the development of a social investment welfare state are really important here. The questions related to, and these go back to some of the reproduction questions, issues related to family policies, early childhood education. I mean, there's a bigger and bigger need to think about these things as an investment. Welfare state is actually it's an economic long-term investment through education, through levels of skills development, creating a competitive advantage like that. And I think the European Union has a serious project there, and it might become even more important in the future. So I think there is, and I'm kind of moving towards almost like an old-fashioned international relations levels of analysis type approach here, but why not? There is the global level, there is the European level, and I think as a mediating level, the European level is important, and then we do need to not stop there, but go and look at the national questions as well. What would the European social model look like if we sort of stick to those ideas that the EU has about social investment welfare state? How many different kinds of varieties can we have of that? How does it work? How do we take a general set of challenges that seem to be the same for everyone and then apply them in a way which potentially brings out different kinds of interpretations of it at the national level? And then finally, and this is both a specific issue but also quite a big one, and potentially, well, I use it as a segue to the bigger questions about welfare state, and this is related to welfare chauvinism and migration. I think we need an input from feminists, but we also need an input from people who look at questions about immigration, integration, multiculturalism, assimilation, whatever the flavor of integration is that countries go for. These have a really important, they have really important repercussions for welfare policy. And also the understanding that we have of what the welfare state is. So I think in some ways a fundamental reason to why the previous analysis of welfare state growth, development and crisis might be dated or even more problematic than it was originally. I mean, I think the industrialization thesis, and Magnus has pointed out that the flaws of that argument, it's persuasive, but it doesn't on its own do the explaining. But I think there might be issues now that make it even more problematic, is that, for instance, if we think about migration now, when the grand old men and women of welfare state research were talking about industrialization, modernization, these kind of things, we didn't really talk about migration as a key issue here. We were looking at a very particular question about welfare. What is a welfare state? Who is it for? It's a very national, very kind of bounded project. And there is a citizenship aspect to all of that, but that citizenship approach was very particular, very limited. And now we have to think about how we go forward with that. So if we're looking at the everyday lived experiences of the citizen, they're very important because we're looking at the effect of the crisis, the effect of austerity on a whole host of different communities and people within our societies. And those effects can also, I mean, they're mediated through political means and through a set of specific institutions, but also their effects can fuel, this is a real effect of policy that can fuel further rise of populist radical right parties, nationalism. So this kind of reaction, I can't remember who it is who calls the populist radical right as a reaction against the postmodern condition. That actually there is a lot to take away from, you know, the welfare state maybe as a kind of ideal model of what some of the European populists would like to go back to. And the reason why they maybe want to do that is, I think, linked to the questions about reproduction that Magnus mentioned, that this goes back to the very question of what is the welfare state there for? What is its purpose? What does it do? And I think there is, and maybe some of this crisis literature and the direction it's taking is also sort of evidence of what the problem is in our debates generally, that it seems like there is, on one hand, there's this idea that, well, the welfare state, maybe because for certain politicians who like the welfare state anyway, one way of arguing for it is to say, well, look, it's not just something nice that we provide for our citizens, but it's actually an economic investment. You know, this is something that we do for our economy. So we can talk about welfare capitalism, where welfare state and the economy are actually quite in a kind of happy marriage. We have, you know, a highly skilled set of workers who can adapt easily to large-scale changes such as Fordism, post-Fordism, these kind of things. And then, well, there's one reason for us to have the welfare state. That's the one kind of side of what I think is quite a kind of dichotomous debate. And the other side is that actually welfare state is about social justice. It is about equality. It is about poverty. It is about those things that make a difference to the everyday lived experiences of the citizens. So, and I think between those two approaches, there's a big tension there. And we need to probably unpack that a little bit. It goes back to the question of what is the welfare state? And crucially for talking about welfare chauvinism and the effect of migration is who is the welfare state for? We can talk about actors, but actors, you know, we can think about subjects and objects here too. Who is it by and who is it for? How do migrants feed into this? If we talk about skills, competitive economies and all that, you could say that certain kinds of migrants may be quite good for this, certain others maybe not, if we're seeing this as some kind of economic investment project. But then we have populist movements who actually argue the exact opposite. So I think it is through those kind of questions, which are also, if you think about questions of, you know, how to communicate some of these things to a wider audience, I think these questions about welfare chauvinism, what does migration do to the welfare state and so on, are probably quite useful sort of vehicles for it. So, and yeah, birth rates are important in that too. When we talk about net migration is probably quite a pointless exercise in statistics, and it doesn't tell very much about the whole picture of migration. But I think what we should remember is that migration is a very complicated set of processes. It's immigration, emigration, and birth rates also being included in that. So I think reproduction is a very good way forward, but then maybe there needs to be a couple of other sort of considerations for how to make sense of that set of rather broad questions about reproduction. And finally, this is an open question maybe on methodology. Maybe it's irrelevant to a seminar series, but maybe not. I mean, I think methodologically, you know, a lot of the literature that we look at has been quite limited to a certain set of methods-related approaches. And I'm just wondering whether questions like this, especially if the decision is that the everyday is important here, whether there would be quite a lot of space for methodological innovation and trying to reach out to some other parts of social science communities, such as political psychologists, geographers, urban sociologists, and so on, to maybe open up not only the kind of answers that we get, but also the ways in which we might answer some of these questions, and being innovative also that kind of way. So I think thinking outside of the box is probably needed. in this case. I'll leave it there. I don't know how much of the time I use, but that's the end. So, thank you.